What you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences. And I've always sort of found you would see things that you would not automatically have come across.
Hello and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast that puts leadership in focus. I'm Scott Challoner, and I'm here to introduce your podcast host today, Jonathan White, who each week is joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, presidents, and maybe one day even the President of the United States. That is, if he is still the president by then. The aim is to discover who these people are who get up every morning and make the world work. Everything is up for discussion, including the future of British trade deals, to government reforms, to the Court of Appeals, and of course, the innovation and success in the country that makes it all worthwhile in the end. We also discuss their take on the current economic and political state of the country, and later on, you'll have the chance to hear Jonathan White's exclusive interview with Lord Pickles, the former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, ex-chairman of the Conservative Party, and of course current co-chairman of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, Jonathan joins Norman Hudson, chairman of Rooflink Industrial and Commercial Limited. Rooflink provides industrial and commercial cladding and roofing and is based in Waltham Abbey, Essex. Hudson and Rooflink have made it a mission statement to dispel the industry's negative ingrained image and establish a positive reputation for care and responsibility. Without further ado, I hand you over to Jonathan White and Norman Hudson in Westminster.
Norman, welcome.
Oh, thank you very much.
No, thank you, Norman, for joining us today. And I thought it might be a wonderful place to start. Obviously, it's been a while since Rooflink's been in the review. I think the listeners would love to know how you all are and how business is going.
A little bit quiet at the moment. We've been a little bit lacking in orders. I think everybody was holding back to see what was going to happen with Brexit.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned the B word before I did, because I think, well, that's certainly something I think we'll be talking about in a little more detail later, as there's an awful lot to say. And it's interesting you say that, obviously, Norm, because that's being echoed by, I think, so many businesses up and down the country. The great hope, I think, is that once people really know what's going to happen, we won't have long now, that release will be there. It's interesting, isn't it? It's not that investment's gone elsewhere. It's not people are spending their money on other things. It's just sat there. So that's at least, I think, some optimism on that front. Now, the work you do at Rooflink, obviously, is technically very skilled and in terms of structural safety, exceptionally important. Now, given you work across so many different sectors, Norman, how have you managed over the years to maintain such, high standards?
Well, because I think we appreciate that we're working in one of the most dangerous industries, because all of our work is at high level. And over the last couple of years, about a quarter of the fatal and life-changing injuries have been caused through falls from height. And we're very conscious of the fact that we've got responsibilities.
Oh, without a doubt. And I think of your record speaks for itself. We could list all the awards the firm has won, but we just don't have time. But I would like to point, obviously, look at that you've, for example, received the Royal Society for Protection of Accidents Gold Award for 16 years running. And I just don't think we can stress how important it is that commitment to safety is key to what you do.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Yes. If somebody has an accident, not just the person that has the accident, it ripples out to their family, their children, and this is why we feel we've got such a need to be so keen on it.
Oh, without a doubt. And especially perhaps in your industry, perhaps it's certainly less bad than it used to be, but there was a reputation where a couple of bad apples in the sector spoiling it for the others. And I know that you've spent so much of your career and running the business in making sure that those standards are raised across the board.
We try very hard. In fact, one of our directors works is a chairman of one of the safety committees. So,
excellent. And perhaps I could ask, the business now established. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Norman, but 2001, if that's right.
That's correct. Yeah.
So very nearly 20 years ago. It must have been quite a journey. What are some of the, looking back on that and in that time, what have been some of the projects that you worked on that really come to mind?
Oh, there's so many large contracts. Some are straightforward, others are extremely complicated.
Yes.
And we have to make sure that our surveys and our inspections are right, and we do the right thing.
And so much and you alluded to it, I think, really, Norman, that recently the market has changed in many ways. One of them, obviously, the Grenfell disaster in London had effects that perhaps a lot of people didn't see coming. First of all, of course, it gave potential clients a very different outlook and made them much more concerned about those who they're working with. And of course, from a policy point of view, how has RoofLink responded to these changing circumstances?
Well, we have got to convince the people we work with, if they want this type of lining board, that it is perfectly safe, because the Grenfell problem was the wrong board was used in the wrong place. And the boards are quite safe, they're fireproof, and if you use them in the right context, they're fine.
And it's just this paranoia that's developed, isn't it? Because now people associate that with something that was done incorrectly. Correct.
That's absolutely right. Yes. Yeah.
And so it really is the importance, I think, of communication has become so relevant. In terms of the other side of things, it's also seen certainly increased regulation and different regulation. Has that, in your opinion, Norman, and you're pretty qualified to answer this, has the regulation been sound or has it been lacking?
Well, certainly as far as Grenfell, and I'm not really qualified to speak about domestic roofing. As far as industrial roofing is concerned, we're quite happy and sure that it's the correct material and it's an extremely good material. Good.
And now perhaps stepping back from the firm itself and looking more broadly here, Norman, what would you say are the major challenges that the sector are facing at the moment? And I mean, perhaps you've already said it, perhaps it is to do with a cautiousness of investing any money at the moment.
Yes, I think it is. We have a number of quite large contracts which have really been hanging on for the best part of the year or so. I mean, we haven't lost them. It's just that the companies haven't proceeded with them.
No, that is interesting, is it? So, I mean, we're speaking the day before, in fact, Britain is due to leave the European Union. And I think a lot of businesses, as we mentioned earlier, Norman, up and down the country, are really rather hoping that once that happens, there will be a general sort of sigh of relief that things are moving on and reinvestment will occur.
I'm quite sure it will. I think really industry for a year has been sitting in limbo, not knowing which way to go. There's very little worse than uncertainty. You don't know whether to invest or not. You don't know whether to develop new products. And I think now we know there's going to be difficulties ahead, but I think people are looking forward now to it being resolved.
Oh, definitely. And I think the important thing as well, whether you voted Remain or Leave, now almost, 4 years ago, and gosh, it feels longer actually sometimes, doesn't it? But but people just want to get on with things,
Yes.
and that's relevant, I think, to whatever sector you work in and whoever you work for. It's become, in a way, it sucked out all of the oxygen in the room. There are so many other things to be talking about, whether it's education or health or indeed housing and industry. The government seems to have been completely unable to talk about any of those things for such a long time now.
It is, yep. It was all I think a lot of members of Parliament have a lot to answer for with the way that they've obstructed things, because it has really had quite a serious effect on us.
No, I tell you what, then I'll put you on the spot here, Norman. Let's say it's a Friday afternoon, just finished lunch, and you for 2 hours you get to become Secretary of State for a bit. A magic wand, you can introduce any reforms you'd like. What would you like to see done? You've got this brand new government with a large majority. What would you like to see done, not just for the industry, but indeed the wider country?
I think we would like some regulation on late payments, tighter controls on customers. I think a lot of small businesses, and we're a small business, do suffer from companies delaying payment. It may be 5-6 months. It's difficult to get around.
It is, and very often, I think, so it would be great if you could explain this, especially for listeners that are familiar, Norm, but correct me if I'm wrong here, but very often it's very much larger corporations, businesses, that can be very late in and defer these payments.
It is, yes, you're right.
And it seems very asymmetrical, doesn't it, that you're able to have these very powerful, really, businesses take a service off of a smaller one and then pretend as if it didn't happen for a few months.
Yes, yeah.
Well,
it makes life difficult.
Oh, certainly almost impossible, and especially when it comes to planning for the future.
Exactly. Yeah, it does, and with all the uncertainty, this is, I think, what has held everybody back.
Without a doubt. So I think there will be people nodding quite furiously in agreement with you on that front, Norman. I think that would be a very popular piece of legislation, and who knows? And let's just hope perhaps that the ministers now, the new ministers, can, once Brexit is done, can get on with it, and we can all move forward together. Now, moving away from Brexit, though, Norman, what's your take at the minute on the current political situation? It's pretty extraordinary, isn't it? We've had a national referendum. We've had two prime ministers resign. A landslide general election after a hung parliament. I mean, does this compare to anything else you've seen over the last few decades?
Not at all. I think everybody you spoke to was sick to the back teeth of it. It really was very debilitating. It never seemed to come to an end. But I think we've got some stability now with the new Prime Minister, and I think he's got a grip on things. He might be a little foolish at times, but I think he's a clever man, and I think he'll get us through.
Yes, and I think whether you agree or disagree with it, I don't see how anyone could not hope that to be true. Because you're entirely right. Where I think this country, we're pretty mild in our politics, and for the last 3.5 years, I think there was just too much of it.
I don't think we've ever known a time like it, not in my lifetime anyway, and I'm getting old.
Oh, come on now, Norman. But I think it's something, the only other relatable bit of time I dare compare it to was probably the mid-70s. But I suppose the great thing is that this time, whereas, and for those of us old enough to remember, Norman, when there was a 3-day week, when
I remember it well.
When there were. When there was no electricity, at least this time, we've got through it without having, indeed rubbish piling high in the streets or ambulances being turned away at hospitals. So I suppose there are some upsides this time. Yeah,
it's been far better, obviously. Yeah, it has.
Now, Norman, I'm conscious of the time because, it's catching up with us. But what advice, could I ask, would you give to young people, especially, who are looking to start their own careers and hopefully, no doubt, be able to work for as long as you have, Norman?
I think a lot of young people want to start at the top rather than the bottom. When I was starting work, you had apprenticeships and you had training and you worked your way up through the system. You had to. But I do think from young people I speak to, they seem to not want to go into industry, not to want to go into physical things. They want to just sit and watch a computer, And
I think that may well be a great... I think you're true. It's true, Norman, on so many fronts, and it feels as if it's difficult these days to have a technical education, something we used to call it. Finding a skill, being able to apply it, and stay with you for life.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you learn these skills. You probably had several jobs when you were young, but each one taught you something. And it put you ready for the rest of your life to know what you were doing and where you're going.
And I think this goes back to, it's 20 years ago now, I suppose, but we're seeing the results of it when the then Labour government said that 50% of young people should go to university, and no one really said why. And as a result, you're right, we have a lot of young people with an awful lot of degrees, but whether they are useful for employment remains to be seen, and especially when it comes to your sector, Norman, and indeed so many sectors like it. As we leave the European Union, we have to be so competitive in these arenas, and you get the feeling that we've got some catching up to do.
Yes, we have. I don't know whether it's relevant, but we've got two joint managing directors. One is Michael you've spoken to. Both of those started with me as apprentices when they virtually left school. Then they're in their 50s now. And
fantastic.
We've stuck together through thick and thin, and we still all work together.
Isn't that it's a fantastic way of being able to do business, and I can't help but feel that hopefully there'll be something to come along before long that we can return to doing exactly that again. Now, look, I'm afraid, Norman, our time really is here now, so I've got to ask. It's the beginning of a new year. It's 2020. What are the plans for Roofline going forward? Rooflink going forward.
Well, we are optimistic that the employment is high. We just want the production to rise, and I think we're going to outperform the EU on the economy side. And I think that would certainly vindicate our leaving if we do that.
Oh, absolutely. Well, look, Norman, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. I know we could have gone for longer, but I'm afraid we have to stop sometime. So it's a pleasure you coming on, and I hope we can speak again.
Thank you very much.
I hope you all enjoyed Jonathan White's interview with Norman, and especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector and how the whole team at Rooflink continues to raise standards. If you've not heard it before, coming up now is Jonathan's conversation with the Parliamentary Review's co-chairman, Eric Pickles. Lord Pickles served as Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government in David Cameron's cabinet before receiving a peerage back in 2018. Lord Pickles remains active as the United Kingdom's anti-corruption champion and the Special Envoy for Post-Holocaust Affairs. I hope you enjoy listening just as much as Jonathan enjoyed speaking to Eric. Here it is now.
Lord Pickles, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you won't mind me reminding the listeners that you've been involved in politics, both local and national, for quite a number of decades. Indeed, before the days we were in the common market. Given your experience over those years, what thoughts have you had over the last few weeks and months about the current political situation the country finds itself in?
Situation is quite dire because we have a parliament that is by and large useless. It's like a bored teenager on a long drive, and it knows what it doesn't want, and it's so bored with Brexit, but it can't agree. So no matter what you put up, it's against it. Are you in favour of a referendum? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of remaining within the single market? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of... No, I don't want to do that, no. And are you in favour of leaving without a deal? No, we don't want to do that. So it's against everything, but there isn't enough votes to be in favour of something. And it could be by the time this podcast goes out that Boris has started on the process of the bill, because we'll be voting on that today. But even then, what people don't seem to understand, this is not the end of Brexit.
Right.
This is barely opening the door of Brexit. We've got years of negotiations about trade agreements, relationships with Europe, putting down pieces of legislation. We get our agriculture, our fisheries, our financial services into place. Brexit is going to go on and on and on and on. I'm sure we are.
Now, the question is, I should actually remind listeners that we are talking on the day that the second reading of the European Renewal Act will take place. So as we speak, we don't quite know. As perhaps like the government front bench don't know what's going to happen. You compare Parliament to a petulant teenager. What do you do to a petulant teenager to sort it out? Is there a chance that it will see sense and push this through this bill without reckoning amendments? Is there a chance it will vote for its own for a general election? How do you see this playing out at the moment?
The sensible thing will be to put this deal through, because I've always been of the view a deal is better than no deal, because this is just the beginning. In order to start the process of Brexit, start the process of the United Kingdom taking over powers that it's not really exercised for 40 odd years, the smart thing is to get this thing through now. But in a way, it's not about Brexit itself. If there was a free vote, this deal would have gone through. Mrs May's deal would have gone through. But it's about politics. It's about a Labour Party that thinks it has a chance, trying to make the Prime Minister, whether it was Theresa May or Boris Johnson, look as though that they are in office but not in power, of delaying as long as possible. There's a lot of talk about an election in the autumn, maybe back end of November, beginning of December, something for us to look forward to before Christmas. It's beginning to look less likely. It's beginning to look as though they might want to drag it into spring to get as far away as possible from the rather decisive moment that Boris came back with a deal. We have to remind ourselves that nobody thought he could deliver a deal, and it has quite shocked them. And if you remember, all this process went through in order to ensure that we're left without a deal. When we have a deal, suddenly, well, no, it's not that kind of deal. We don't want that kind of deal. We want something different.
I think the vast majority of people in this country, whether Remain or Leave, now would be very satisfied for this to come to a amiable conclusion. And as you correctly just said, because when it does come to those in the opposition who claim to want this to end, and then introduce reckoning amendments, they introduce new objections to it, the general public are getting quite frustrated.
But you've got to understand that quite a lot of people don't get beyond a small area within Westminster, sometimes a cliche referred to as the Westminster bubble, and go back to their own patch. Now, by and large, everybody hates their MP, except when they're at home doing the fairs, wandering around, helping people. So they, in a way, they're cosseted to that great, which I feel is coming as a tsunami of change.
You were, of course, MP for Brentwood for
25 years.
Absolutely. What would you? I mean, of course, you president there as well, despite being a proud Yorkshireman, obviously representing a good Essex seat. What would you say to your constituents right now? Hang in there; it'll be all right.
Well, it's different when you're a member of Parliament because you've got to kind of toe the government line a little bit. So one thing I found now is I've got my weekend back and I say what I want, and I think I always say to our constituents is that it is pretty hopeless down there.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think, honest assessment, it's something I think the Parliamentary Review has always done quite well, talking frankly about problems, issues, and also not just good practice, but leadership.
Well, I was used to read it when I was a member of Parliament, because, what you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences, and I've always sort of found it quite a kind of a chatty magazine, but also you would see things that you would not automatically have come across. I certainly have attended the receptions over the year, and it's amazing the things you kind of pick up.
And I think it's important to stress it's not because politicians aren't interested, because honestly, as you all know more than anyone, it's an issue of time. And to be able to have a channel and a platform where you can keep communication lines between businesses, schools and policymakers is so exceptionally important.
I think so, and it's important that it's beholden to nobody. People, pay to be part of the publication, pay to be members, and it's a way of not beholden to government, not beholden to anything.
Now, echoing the words, of course, your fellow Chairman Lord Blunkett has said, what some might not know is that you started your political journey perhaps even further left than David Blunkett.
Absolutely, I was a communist.
Now, what was it?
At the age of 14, I was bought the Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and I read it from cover to cover. I tried to read it a few years back, and I just couldn't follow anything.
So I was going to say perhaps you might know the minds of the show front bench better than they do themselves.
From my position when I first joined, I would regard them as recalcitrant running dogs of the capitalist system.
Now, what was it that moved you from radical Marxists to running the only inner city council controlled by the Conservatives in the 80s?
Well, I was very young, and I was fascinated by what was happening in what was then Czechoslovakia and Dubček, and the revolution that was taking place there inside communism, and the way in which he was repressed by Mr. Brezhnev, and the tanks and taking over. I was so angry. And I'm 16, remember. I'm really angry. And I thought, what's the most outrageous thing I can do? I will join the Conservative Party as a protest. And I kind of sticked around, and my family thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to it. I was Eric the Tory. And
I think you announced this quite grandly as a grand protest.
I did indeed, but I kept going down, and it was an exciting time. People were developing the ideas of what the Conservative Party should be. Selsdon man, even Heath looked radical. We had different ideas, and it eventually clicked. And at some point, I became a Conservative, and that was 51 years ago. I think I'm definitely 100% a Tory now.
Through and through.
Through and through.
Although I do know the story, most people might guess that a dialogue conservative like yourself would have perhaps a portrait of Mr. Thatcher or Mr. Churchill in their office, but who is it that you have?
I had Che Guevara, which I always had him over my left shoulder for visitors, and they always used to kind of, you see their eyes going up and thinking, who, I can't possibly be it. Someone asked me if it was Desi Arnaz. I thought it was married to Lucille Ball. But no, the reason I did that was to remind me and to remind my officials that without constant vigilance, the cigar-chomping commies would take over.
I'm sure David Bunk was in the room to reply to that, actually. But in that long journey, you eventually ended up, of course, in 2010, doing something most Conservatives would never thought they would have to do, but in a coalition government with, of all people, the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
Now, something I think perhaps today more than ever, people and our politics seems to be almost wholly determined on how we voted in a referendum 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the most normal thing would happen after something like that would be the country would come together, and if anything, we're more divided. I mean, I thought working in the coalition, I'm proud to have been part of that coalition. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Liberal Democrats, who I think realised that, like all minority partners in a coalition, they would suffer at the polls.
Do you think we've lost the ability recently as a people to work with those that we might disagree with on issues more than we used to?
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, you can see various members of the Conservative Party working closely with Liberal Democrats and Labour to defeat their own government, but it's not a thing I think I would want to encourage.
Quite. And I should remind listeners, we are recording this in Victoria, just over the road, Cardinal Place, a fantastically new development site which wouldn't have been there without some of your legislation. What was the proudest?
I personally approved it.
Absolutely. What was the proudest moment, do you think, in serving as Secretary for 5 years?
It's my actual proudest moment. We did a thing called Troubled Families, which was the first centre-right attempt to deal with poverty and to deal with difficult families that were causing a disproportionately large amount of call upon the state, and it was on the basis of tough love. It's on the basis of getting people into jobs. It's about dealing with the kind of the family as a whole, not just one or two individuals that were having a problem. And I'm pleased that it's continued.
And since, I should very much stress that since, of course, you're stepped down being an MP, you do have your weekends back, but that's not to say you haven't remained very active and very busy. Of course, continues the government's anti-corruption champion, shone the harsh light of day over malpractice in the local government. Indeed, the Queen's speech that we've just had includes some of your recommendations from 2016. I think a couple of things on that. First of all, are you surprised, I may imagine you may not be, at some of the backlash towards, in this country, introducing voter ID for voting?
It is absurd, and it's particularly absurd coming from the Labour Party, because it was largely Labour's vulnerability that got my interest in trying to do something about it. And it's a bit like saying, you're requiring people to show some ID, that this is suppressing voting. It's a bit like saying the post office is suppressing parcels because they demand to see some ID. I think they've got a bee into their bonnet that this is something like that goes in the state to repress. It's not. It's about giving confidence to the system. Now, the Electoral Commission and foreign observers have warned us for such a long time that our electoral system is vulnerable. And it's to misquote John Major, we are really sort of old males cycling to evensong and Warbane. Yeah, I mean, it's such a basic thing. It's an important thing. And it was kind of interesting in some of the trials. They did a focus group with a bunch of young Asian girls. And they said they thought the process of a photo ID would actually give them a greater confidence in the fairness of the system. I make all kinds of recommendations to stop postal vote harvesting, to stop various fraud taking place, to stop intimidation at counts, to stop intimidation outside polling stations.
And I think you referenced it earlier, the Westminster bubble. A lot of the places where this occurs and the places where this does go on are places where perhaps many members, many people in the press don't usually go to.
No, they don't. We saw a YouGov poll that said the overwhelming majority, well in the 60%, thought this idea was sensible.
Yeah, and I imagine you're quite proud that recommendation is in the speech.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit frustrated they didn't do it sooner, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that they are doing it.
It's as if the government's time has been taken up by something else and we've not focused on anything domestic.
Absolutely.
But with a man, though, with his roots in local government, do you think, and how much you've worked with that report, especially looking at them carefully, how would you rate our current state of local municipal politics?
Local government's very good. I mean, local government, don't get me wrong, it's by and large corruption-free, and it does a remarkably good job. And it was, in truth, my worries about local government and that these measures were brought in. I don't believe the fraud is big enough to be able to take a parliamentary seat, but it is big enough to take a council. And if you are negligent, uncaring about the probity of the poll, you're likely to be equally negligent about the awarding of contracts to your friends. So it's all past that. But local government is a very enduring part of our constitution. I got a bit stick because we had to take some money from them, but by and large they survive very well.
Excellent. Now, beyond obviously that work, you're also, of course, the British envoy for post-Holocaust issues.
Yeah, sure.
That's very dear to your heart. I know you've done some fantastic work recently, including with obviously former Shadow Chancellor from the Review, Ed Balls. Would you mind, if you could just let the listeners know what projects you are working on with that and really the importance that has to so many communities around the country? Well,
I used to be very unpleasant about Ed Ball, and he used to be very unpleasant about me. But I found working with him remarkably easy, and we've not had a single row in 2 years, and by now we're beginning to be able to finish each other's sentences. We're building a memorial to the Holocaust next to Parliament with a learning centre below it, and the reason why the Prime Minister chose that site is that it was David Cameron, and he wanted to ensure that when people left the memorial, they would look and see Parliament and recognise that it was the last bastion against tyranny. But more important, to remind people who work in Parliament that the legislature has a choice. It can either protect its citizens or it can oppress its citizens. And we do know that it was a compliant legislature that brought in the Nuremberg laws. And at a time when there are parts of Europe that are seeking to rewrite their history and seeking to see themselves as only the victims of the Nazis, I'm determined that we should tell the truth in an unblinking way. We are, I suppose, at a critical crossroads when the last survivor is likely to be no longer with us within the next decade and a half. And at that point, we do know that history starts to be reassessed. I think it was Simon Sharma that talked about this. And he was referring to the French Revolution. And of course, most of the books written in the 1850s are the ones that have shaped our view of the French Revolution. But the difference is this, that slightly over 100 years ago, my grandfather Edgar grabbed hold of his Lee Enfield and walked out of a trench in the Somme and walked towards the Germans. And within a few minutes, most of the people he'd been brought up with, most of his friends were dead. Nobody doubts that he did that. But there's a whole industry out there that doubts that the Holocaust took place. So that's why it's important that we help frame that narrative.
And you referenced as well, it's so important, especially at this time of history, 7 years afterwards, that young people in schools get the correct education about it. How do we compare as a country in doing that compared to some of our European friends?
We I think, compare remarkably well, and particularly because we've got a mixture of things. We ensure through the lessons of Auschwitz that 2 pupils from every secondary school go to Auschwitz each year, that they have a preliminary meeting, a visit and a wrap-up. We ensure that Holocaust Day is remembered in January. Now, I can remember starting that, or I'm not starting it, but being part of a foot soldier of people that put it together. And, it was like one man and a dog, but now it's quite a massive, it's a massive event. So I think we are quite good at remembering that. I think where we perhaps do need to have a wider understanding is beyond the death camps. And we need to kind of understand the Einsatzgruppen, which was the roving murder squads, how important they were. You were more likely to have been shot in a ditch than to end up in a death camp. And the hinterland of that is Lithuania, where I was last week talking to colleagues, and through Belarus and the Ukraine. And it's really important that we ensure that we register where those death sites are.
And I think certainly, and I'm going to sit down next to speak, which hopefully won't be too long away. It's something I think we'd be very happy to keep updates on how that project is going, because it's so important and people do need to be aware of it. Looking to the future, though, I imagine we're actually very content and happy. The former Prime Minister, friend and colleague David Cameron just released his book, and you did quite unscathed from it.
I came out, he was very nice about
Yes.
it. I even bought the audio version because he was reading it, and he obviously, but there was a fair bit of affection, and I'm rather glad they left out one or two of the other embarrassing things.
Maybe not this time.
Yeah.
That's, but it's important, I think, and I'm conscious of the time, but I think it's important that today people have become so perhaps caught up in what's happening in this country regarding Brexit. Looking to the future, what would you say that it's a positive thing that this country has to look forward to?
Well, we're a large trading nation. We're a large economy. We're a liberal democracy, and it would be good to get through Brexit over the coming years. And it would be good to start to look at some of the social issues that we need to tackle, those that have been left behind by our economic progress. And it will be good to see some solid investment in this country, both in terms of its infrastructure, but also in terms of the way it operates as a democracy.
And I know there's going to be a huge focus of the next review. Pickles, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, it has been a pleasure both listening to and learning from our guests. I and Jonathan White hope you all enjoyed listening. Until next time, Jonathan and I are now off to the Westminster Arms to raise a glass to raising standards. Or at least we would be if the pubs weren't all closed due to the COVID-19 outbreak. So in this instance, Jonathan's front room is just going to have to do. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube, and Spotify. The views expressed by each guest in the podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pickles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry, or any other guest on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.